So let's get on to Romans then. The righteousness of God, really, really foundational, important book in so many different ways. Kind of excited to get to it. But let me start out by saying this. Remember where you were in your life 8 years ago. Remember what the most important issues were for you 8 years ago? Are those issues the same that you have today? Probably not, yeah. I mean, where were you 8 years ago? Were you in 8th grade or what? Yeah. Okay, so just think about how much your world has changed in 8 years, and it's a similar situation between the writing of Galatians and the writing of Romans. Right? So I don't ever want you to forget about what we learned in Galatians and all that sort of stuff, but you can kind of leave that behind because we've moved on to totally new issues now. Right? Some of that foundation is still good, but Romans is a very different book, and in fact, some ways it's almost the opposite. Because as we're going to find out here, in Galatians, it was the Jews clearly had the upper hand, and the Gentiles were the kind of the second-class citizens. Now it's almost reversed, like the Gentiles have the ascendancy, and the Jews who've been kicked out of Rome and are coming back in are kind of feeling like, oh, maybe they're the ones who are being left out a little bit. So it's almost reversed the situation, and lots of things have changed. So what I want to do today is to introduce you to the book, give you some of the background information, and also introduce you to some of the big macro issues of the book. And I hope that we're actually going to get to chapter 16 today for a little bit of time, so that when we get back together on Tuesday, we can actually hit the ground running in chapter 1 and make it all the way through, because there's too much really, really important stuff to miss in chapter 1 to have to go over introductory matters and stuff next Tuesday. So with that then, let's begin with this book, okay? Now, we're going to start just a quick picture of the map of the first and second missionary journeys. And I'm sure that those are kind of a blur in your head. You probably don't know them. I'd be really, really surprised if you could work your way through them. But you can see them up there. You see on the second missionary journey, we get all the way to Philippi up there in the top of the map. And we get into to Europe and Athens and Corinth and all that sort of stuff. Probably around 52 or so. And then on the third missionary journey, we're going to add the third missionary journey to it here, looks something like that. On that third missionary journey, Paul gets to Corinth in about 57 A.D. And when he gets there, this is when he writes the letter to Rome. He's never been to Rome before, never been close to Rome. But about 57 A.D., again, 8 years after the story of Galatians, he writes the letter. Then he heads back to Jerusalem, and we've been through Acts 21 quite a bit, and that's the story there. And that takes us down to Caesarea, where he's imprisoned for 2 years. And then finally, he makes his way all the way back to Rome around 60 to 62. So 5 years after, or 3 or 4 years after he writes the letter, he finally makes it back there. But that's kind of his geographical connections with Rome up to this point, okay? Now, the PowerPoint is out there. It's on the S drive. You might want to refer to it. And there's probably way too much text on this PowerPoint. I apologize for that. But it's one of those things that you probably just need to look at or print off on your own, because I did a lot of it today, and just a lot of information for you to see. So let's talk about the background of the church. And as Jared has already figured out, did you actually fill that part out, question number 1 for the homework?
No, I didn't do it because you said we would cover it in class.
Oh, yeah, okay, I did say we were covering in class. Okay, this is actually some of the homework, or was on the homework at least, that we were going to cover in class, and you can take notes there if you want to, or you can just kind of leave it up here. It doesn't matter to me, whatever suits your learning style best, okay? But here's the history of the church. AD 33 to 49, the beginning of the church in Rome. First question is, how does it get started so early? Were there any missionaries who made it to Rome in AD 33, and who would they have been according to Acts? Kind of a loaded question, but I wasn't sure if we had covered this somehow before. It just feels like we have, but maybe my memory is just tricking me and going all the way back to the book of Acts from last semester. So have we broached this question at all before? Or do you have a clue about how the people in Rome got evangelized? Andrea, is that a hand up or not? Yeah, I think so. In Acts chapter 1, you find out that there were Jews actually from Rome, right? One thing is for sure, the church is not founded by Peter, as Catholic tradition says. Peter wasn't there, and in fact, Paul is really, really careful in some of his epistles to say, I don't want to build on anybody else's foundation. And what he meant by that was he wasn't interested in going to places that had been evangelized. He wanted to go to unevangelized places. Of course, he'd go back to build people up where he had been. But if Peter had been there, Paul wouldn't have ventured there. Okay, probably converts from Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, verses 10, or Paul's previous travels. And this is a very mobile society at this point in time. And so when we get to the end, to chapter 16, you're going to notice Paul lists a lot of names. So he'd never been there, but he knew a lot of people who were there. So the next major point of history for the Roman church is 49 A.D. Just think of the same time the Jerusalem Council is happening, the same time the Pizza Hut thing is happening, all that sort of thing is happening. Roman historian Suetonius records the Emperor Claudius's edict of expulsion of Jews for rioting over a certain slave named Chrestus. Now, again, I'm sorry to keep asking this, but did we ever talk about this somewhere in this class? Okay, my semesters just keep running together here. What's happening is this. There's a riot in Rome over a bunch of Jews, and Suetonius is this pagan Roman historian, and this is the way he describes it. Can you kind of read between the lines and imagine what might have been going on in 49 AD and why in the world the Jews would create such an uproar as to get their entire race, their entire nationality, kicked out of Rome? Why would they riot over some slave named Chrestus? This is a pagan historian who's writing it. He's an outsider. He probably doesn't know the whole story. He might even get the name a little bit wrong. Yeah, what he's probably said, this is probably a riot over Christ, right? Can you imagine the riot which Jews in Rome might have had over the Christ and who is the Christ and whether or not this Jesus was the Christ? Now, we're speculating here a little bit, but almost every theologian who writes about this says this is pretty safe speculation. It's probably what's going on, probably between the believing Jews and the non-believing Jews and fighting about who the Messiah is. And, the Romans are known for one thing, and that's peace. They don't really care, just like parents. They don't care about justice. They just want quiet. Right? So amen. That's right. So it's like, I don't know what this problem is. We're not going to try to solve it, but just be gone, all of you. And they're all gone. Right? So they're gone, and we actually, there's also biblical record of this too, because in Acts chapter 18, we're going to see it. The very first time that Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla, Luke says, and they had just been kicked out of Rome because of Claudius's decree. So this is what happens in 49. So remember now then, how old is this church in Rome? Well, probably founded in 33 when those people got back from Pentecost. So it's fairly old, right? And probably a number of Jews and probably Gentiles who were hangers-on, whether or not they were proselytes or just full Gentiles, we don't know, but we're years past Acts 15. So my guess is the way news travels, there were probably a number of Gentiles in the church. Right? So this is going to set us up for a political situation here in a second. My guess is that the Gentiles then take leadership in the church because all the Jews are gone. And up to that point, you know that the Jews who knew the Scriptures were the ones who were the leaders in the church, and now the Gentiles take leadership because the Jews are gone. Here's the reference. Paul at Corinth in the second missionary journey, not the third, second missionary journey, 51 or 52 A.D., Acts 18:1. After this, Paul departed from Athens. Well, you can see the whole record of it there, okay? So, what happens next? Well, what happens next is this. In 54, the Jews are readmitted under Nero, and they come back to house churches that are now led by Gentiles. Before I get to the whole end of that sentence, let me just say, Nero, whenever you think of Nero, you probably think of bad, crazy, insane, evil persecutor. But that's not really quite true because there was a long time in his reign where he was actually a pretty good guy. And it's not until the latter part of his reign, like in 67 or so, where he really begins to go nuts and does foolish, harsh, barbarous things. But the fact that Nero lets them back in is not some sort of trap. It's just Nero thinking, well, that was probably not very fair, and, we'll let them back in. So he lets them back in, and they come back to house churches that are now led by Gentiles. So just stop right there then. Let's talk about the dynamic of the church in Rome. When you get back to the church in Rome, what do you think happens? And let your most Christian church background, cynical experience take over here. Yeah, probably so. And the Gentiles said, we're doing fine without you, right? And you probably got these tensions. Even if people are trying to be Christian and trying to be cordial, you probably got some tensions because, trust me, whenever one regime takes over for another, they do things differently than the previous regime did it. And there's always hurt feelings. They're like, how come they're just spitting on our past, spitting on our experience? And I'm sure when the Gentiles took over, they did the same thing, but the Jews weren't down. Now the Jews come back in, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, and this is a real situation with real people and real tensions, and this is a difficult thing. Right? So, like, who is in charge? And there are a lot more dynamics, but I'll just leave it at that, okay? So the date of Paul's letter in 57 AD is going to address, at least in part, this situation. Okay? We good so far? All right, let's expand it then and get a little bit more detailed about what the occasion letter is like. The occasion, or the big questions that desperately needed an answer in 57. So we're going to open up the scale a little bit beyond Rome and take a look at the entire program of God and how it's doing and how Romans can speak to that. And on a local level in Rome, the issue we probably have is what you've just guessed. We've probably got some Jew-Gentile tensions within the body. And on a global level, in the world, the issues we have are these. Now just take a sentence, take a look at that sentence, read it over. Imagine yourself on vacation when you were in 4th grade and see if it rings true. Right? I mean, think about where we are in time and go all the way back to that Acts chapter 1 situation where when Jesus went up into heaven, the apostles said, will you at this time restore the kingdom? And Jesus doesn't answer the question. And the hope is that he's going to do it really, really soon. Well, we've had some serious setbacks since then, right? We really want to believe, but it's getting harder year after year. Is God really faithful to his covenant promises? What's the deal? Why the delay? Why is the program going off the rails so badly? Now, if you can't identify with that and understand what's going on there, realize you've had 2,000 years to get used to this idea of delay. But they were right on the heels of Jesus having come the first time and sensed, like everybody else was, that, oh, this is it, right? And then they say, oh, it's not quite yet. It's going to come soon. But then it doesn't come, it doesn't come, it doesn't come. And now it's kind of getting to a kind of a breaking point. Like, come on, what is going on in this program? So, the purpose of the letter is to at least do these two things. Number one, to answer those Jew-Gentile tensions. And then number two, to answer these questions about God. So first of all, to answer Jew-Gentile tensions. Not like the Galatians questions of Gentile status, but now almost the reverse. Have the Jews been left behind because of their rejection? And we'll get into this in a second. Think of this at least on the local level and then on the bigger level too. Is God's program moving ahead without them? Has God now privileged the Gentiles ahead of Jews? Could God the parent really like his Gentile sons better? Because frankly, by 57 AD, the nation, well, how would you describe the nation of Israel's response to Messiah? Ryan? Yeah, okay, down, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you got that one little bright spot there in Acts 21 where he says there are thousands of believers who are zealous for the law, but thousands out of millions is not very good. And so over and over, it's like, okay, Jesus came, the first generation rejected him, but when the resurrection happens and the apostles go back out and start preaching, are they going to change their minds and repent? And the answer after 25 years is, nope, we're pretty well happy to have rejected him. And we keep doing it, right? So, the question is, now that we are in Rome, does God like these Gentiles better? Have the Jews been rejected? Now, to the next one. To answer questions about God, the question, is God righteous and does he keep his promises? Well, we've been through this whole thing of when Messiah came, it was the third part of the land, nation, and leader, right? So it was like, wow, yes, God does keep his promises. God sent his Messiah, kudos for that, but Israel and the world have pretty much rejected him. I mean, that's pretty clear. Everywhere Paul goes on his missionary journeys, yeah, he'll start a little church, but it's not like Athens converts. It's not like the city of Corinth converts. It's not like the kingdom has come. And so the world, and certainly Israel, have rejected Messiah. And number two, as we've said so many times before, he's not here now sitting on anyone's throne. What's up with that? How do you explain that kind of delay? Is God ever going to keep his promises about restoring the world? And number two, is he going to use Israel to do it as he promised? Because if you look at the world right now, it sure doesn't look like he's going to use Israel to do it. So, some of this is due to the already not tension we've seen before, like when is it going to happen? But those are some questions that are really starting to rise to the surface here. Well, how is God's program going? It's not like we expected it. Israel seems to be set on the shelf. God isn't making any great progress to restore the world. And my goodness, is in fact God going to keep his promises? Is he in fact righteous? So, the purpose of the letter, I think, is to answer those things. And let me then talk about the righteousness of God. Because as you saw on the very first screen, we get into that very memorable phrase in Acts chapter 1 pretty quickly. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. The righteousness of God, big idea in this book. So what does that mean? Well, when we say the phrase the righteousness of God, there are at least two aspects. The first one is this, that God has an inherent moral uprightness. In his being, he is perfect and good and morally upright. I think we all can appreciate and understand that. But there is also this very necessary, important aspect, which is number two, which is the expression of number one in his relationships. That is, if he is in his being morally upright, does this show up in the way he treats other people? In his relationships with others, mainly in keeping his promises. Now, let me show you a couple of definitions here, okay? This one comes out of Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible, and I just wanted you to see the text here. Again, this is why I said there's too much text here to take notes on. That's why you kind of need to pull it up and just look at it for yourselves. But I just want us to read it together. It says this, conformity to a certain set of expectations which vary from role to role. Righteousness is fulfillment of the expectations in any relationship, whether with God or other people. So you can see in this definition, there's a pretty good emphasis on which one of those, number one or number two. Yeah, it's number two, right? Because I think of number one as kind of just inherently within God. Number two, how does it play itself out in relationships with others? And this is a major part of the definition of righteousness. It is applicable at all levels of society and is relevant in every area of life. Therefore, righteousness denotes the fulfilled expectations in relationships between man and wife, parents and children, fellow citizens, employer and employee, merchants and customers, rulers and citizens, and professors and students, and God and man. Right? So to use the phrase, this phrase which we never use, except maybe in some sort of exalted prayer, to use the phrase in an ongoing paragraph or sentence, how would we describe Lori? What would Lori have to do to be a righteous student? Not to pick too much on Lori, I mean just on anybody. How would Lori be a righteous student? Would she have to come into class glowing? Would she have to come into a class with a halo around her head? Would she have to come into class? How would she come to class? To be a righteous student, according to the definition. Any ideas at all? She would have an inherent moral uprightness, that's true, but it has to do with the fulfillment of expectations in the relationship. So what are my expectations in my relationship with dear Lori as my student? See that? Isn't that cool? Look at that. The guy brought his homework to class. What a righteous student you are. Very good. Does somebody else have a hand up over there? Are you going to contribute to what we're going to say? Or are people just stretching? Dahlia? It would be faithfulness, but faithfulness is another word to describe this kind of thing. But this is part of the definition of righteousness, that you are right within, and it shows up because you behave rightly according to the expectations of the relationship. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is. It's very close to faithfulness. Mm-hmm. Depending upon the fulfillment of one's expectations, an individual could be called righteous, and his or her acts and speech could be designated as righteous. Okay? So here's another definition. This one comes from New Bible Dictionary. The Hebrew tzedek probably arrives from an Arabic root meaning straightness. Again, you see straightness there, probably relating to which one of the definitions, one or two? Probably to one, right? Inherently moral straightness. Leading to the notion of an action which conforms to a norm. Speaking of which one? Number two. Yeah, right. Okay, so you're seeing it here. There is, however, considerable richness in the biblical understanding of this term, and it's difficult to render either the Hebrew or Greek words concerned by a simple English equivalent. One basic ingredient in the Old Testament idea of righteousness is a relationship both between God and men and between man and man. Referred to relations between men, righteous action is action which conforms to the requirements of the relationship, in a more general sense promotes the well-being and peace of the community. Andrea? Yeah. Technically, in that sense, then the expectations might be wrong, but it's still a standard which you measure it against. So even if the expectations were low, but you met them, you would be righteous. In the very same way, when a person goes before a judge can declare them righteous according to the law. You have met the expectations of the law, or you haven't, depending on whatever the law is. Now, in this situation, the law that we're going to talk about is God's law and God's promises. And is God righteous? Has He kept His promises, or is He not? That's going to be the expectation. But you're right to ask that question. All right? So, the expression of, number one, in His relationships, especially in keeping His promises. So, God as the creator and rescuer has promised to set the world right again as it was in the beginning, right? And we know that from Genesis 3. His faithfulness, His faithfulness, or lack thereof, to fulfill the promise, determines whether or not He is actually righteous. Now, again, we can say that this is a fairly objective standard because it's God's covenant. It's God's promises. Is God faithful? Is he righteous in the sense that He has fulfilled what He has promised? So you can understand a little bit now why the question has come up, right? Just because of what we talked about. How come God isn't doing anything right now? Is He righteous? Is He good inside? Is He good outside? Is He going to keep what He actually promised? Paul's big point, of course, is that God is indeed righteous in both senses of the term here. He is morally upright, and He's going to do what He said. And he sets out to prove that this charge, God is not righteous, or even doubt, is God righteous? In Romans is not true, because that's what people are saying when they look at the whole plan and say, I'm not sure it's really working out right. And Paul comes back and says, no. He is faithful to His promises. He is morally upright inside. He is righteous. So when we talk about the righteousness of God, it's a really rich concept that's going to show up all the way through this book. Right? So, are you ready to look at the 16 chapters? Here it is. Now, I don't know if you've heard rumors about the class. Probably you haven't, because the last time we taught it was such a long time ago. But I can tell you what your final exam is going to be right now. Are you ready for it? What you're going to do in your final exam, and don't choke at this, because I will get you ready for it, and when the time comes, you will be absolutely ready for it. Your final exam is going to be to write out a summary paragraph for every chapter in Romans and relate it, each chapter to the other, in a narrative story way, so that you can think your way through the entire book of Romans, 16 chapters. And you will be champs at it. You will be able to do it. All right? And here's just the first start. Anybody want to quit now? You can't. It's too late. You got to stay. But you will. You'll get that, and you'll be very good at it. You will be able to walk your way through and talk your way through the book of Romans in a conversational way as though you're speaking to someone who never knew it before. Because you want to become masters of the righteousness of God. You want to be able to speak the gospel, and the entire book is the gospel. In fact, you'll be able to do it backwards and forwards. You will, because that's one of the things we're going to practice. We're going to practice doing it from 16 to 15 to 14 and go all the way back. Yeah, I kid you not, all right? So, here's how the book explains the righteousness of God. You don't have to write this down. But chapter 1 says, it's true. The whole world is totally broken. It's true. I mean, God promised to put it back together, and I will admit that it is completely broken. And in fact, even the Jewish people are broken too. They may not think they are, but they're broken too. But the good news is that God faithfully provides a solution. Notice it's a red solution. And just because God's provided that solution doesn't mean everybody gets to be a part of it, because you have to have personal blue faith in that solution, Abraham in chapter 4. But if you put your faith in that solution, then what happens is you get shalom with God. God will start to put your individual life back in a perfectly, properly functioning order so that you can relate to Him and have shalom with Him and relate to Him as you were supposed to. And what that means is, and we're going to talk about several implications, that means one of the great things is you finally have the freedom to make right choices. You're no longer a slave to sin. And that's a good thing, because previously you couldn't do that before, and I'm going to just drive that point home in the Paul says, I'm going to drive that point home in the life of Israel in chapter 7. But the really good news is that God is finally going to restore all of creation. And the creation is groaning now, but we're going to put it back together, and we're going to bring Eden back. Now, you might ask me, what about Israel? Because Israel is not part of this thing, and a lot of Israel has rejected Him. Does that mean your program has gone off the rails? And God says, no, not really, because I didn't choose all of Israel to be a part of this saving process. And in fact, many Israelites simply didn't have the faith, and that's why they reject. But the good news is that I will save all of Israel and still use them in the end. Of course, what that means now is that I want you to live in unity with each other, because you are kind of a picture of how I'm putting the world back together. And live in harmony with the government. You should even eat together. Now, that sounds silly the way I put it there, but it's, in Galatians we talked about that. The big examples, 2:11 to 14. Can you get together at Pizza Hut? I want you to eat together. And Jesus transcends cultures, chapters 14 and 15. And in chapter 16, he says to them very carefully, I like you. I love you. Which is, again, an expression of God putting the world back together. Okay? Now, what this is going to look like is this. God indeed is putting the whole world back together. Right? Emphasis from 1 to 8. And in fact, He is going to use Israel to do it. And after He uses Israel to do it, even right now, here's what it looks like right now when He's putting the world back together. So you can understand how this entire book is dedicated to the idea of, God, what's going on? And God says, no, I've got it under control. I am going to put it back together. I'm going to use Israel, and you are kind of a little outpost of society, but it's all about keeping my promises, because I am righteous, and I will keep the promises which I made. All right? So here's what I want to do, just kind of a fun little exercise. You can see what we're going to do. I'm outlining some group work here. And the group work I want to outline is defining the gospel from Romans. Now, let me show you why. You might want to open up your Bibles, but if you don't have one handy, I've got one right here, okay? And right here, we're going to look at obviously several verses here. We're going to start with verse 1, where Paul says, a slave of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, right there. But the good news is, pun unintentional but came out. The good news is that he is actually going to define that for us in the next verses. So, my question to you then is, could you please define gospel from 1:1 and start with just 1:1 to 4? Now, disabuse your minds of whatever other definitions you've had and ask yourself, how is Paul defining the word in the first 4 verses? And then just limit yourself to that, because then we're going to go on. We're going to say, okay, now if we include verses 5 and 6, how does the definition change? And then if we include chapters 1 through 8, how does the definition change? And then if we include 9 through 11, how does the definition change? You understand? So what I want you to do first off is group up for just 60 seconds and give me a definition of the gospel from 1 to 4. And then we'll go on, okay? 60 seconds. Okay, are we done? Tell me what you got, and then I'll show you what I got, and we'll decide if yours is better or mine's better. Okay? You might be better. If it is, we'll go with yours. Okay? So, start with 1 to 4. Define the gospel from 1 to 4. Who will volunteer? And everybody's going to have to volunteer at some point. So if you get it over now, Rachel, you're smart.
We said it was fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy for the Messiah through Jesus Christ, who is with God.
Yeah, very good. Fulfillment of the Old Testament promises through Messiah, of the Messiah through Jesus Christ, who is both God and man. That's good. That's pretty good. Anybody want to add to it? He died and rose again. Okay. Yep, that's good. So far in what you've got here, whom should you include in the definition? Somebody back there, Ryan or Parker? Okay, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and God. What kind of humans other than Jesus should you include in the definition? What? Son of David? David's kind of a Jewish king, right? So my guess is that here, 1 through 4, you shouldn't expand it beyond what he has. And so far, God has been faithful to his, God will be faithful to his promises to bring Jesus, the Messiah, in order to rescue Israel. Right? How did I say it? Jesus, crucified and resurrected Messiah, has come to rescue Israel as God promised. Are there promises in the Old Testament to say Jesus came, the Messiah was going to come and rescue Israel? Oh my goodness, they're all over the place. That's what most of it is all about. Right? So, again, just letting the text define, I think that's close to it. Did you have something else in your definition that I didn't include up there? Essentially? Did we catch it all? You said he was God and man. That's probably pretty good too. You could put that in. All right. Okay, then you can see how this is going to go. You ready to include the verses 5? Yeah, Mrs. Ty. Yes. I'm pulling the rescuing the descendant of David. The Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel 7. This is one who will rule over Israel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, son of David. What that means is you're going to get a son of David who is going to be the king of Israel. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for making that clear, since I didn't. All right. Then let's go on to verses 5 to 6. So take another 60 seconds. This shouldn't be too hard now that you got the first part down. 60 seconds. Go. Okay, it's not even that hard, is it? You done? What'd you add to it? Yeah, the Gentiles, right? And this includes all the nations of the world as well. So you can see how the gospel is expanding. But we still haven't got the full definition of the gospel yet, because we haven't included chapters 1 to 8. Now, I don't know if I should give you 60 seconds for that, or we should just talk about it. But did you catch what I said in the introductory overview about chapter 8? Do you know what's in chapter 8? Say it again, Ben? The final restoration of all creation. Yeah, the creation is groaning until the sons of God are revealed, so that the creation can be lifted from its own curse. So in Romans chapter 8 and all that discussion about all things work together for good, he has just finished the final blessing and reversal of the curse over the material creation. So if we want to talk about the gospel here all the way through chapter 8, then you would say, and this includes all the material creation as well, taking the curse away and restoring Eden. Because that's part of the original promise. Right? So now we've got the gospel all the way through the first 8 chapters. Then include chapters 1 to 11, or add 9 to 11 here. Now, it's probably not going to do you too much good to try to skim those 3 chapters. You're going to have to depend upon what I said or your own theology and connect it with the introduction so far. So let me give you 60 seconds, because if you remember that stuff, you can do it in 60 seconds, and if you can't, you won't get it in 3 hours anyway. So 60 seconds on your mark, is set, go. Okay, what do you got for 1 to 11? Brian? Yeah, I think that's probably safe to say. Anybody else have an opinion about it or something to add? I don't know if that's what I said or not. Yeah.
God being completely sovereign over all, can use any vessel he wants to choose Israel.
Okay, and he's choosing Israel. That's a good point. He is definitely going to use Israel in the process. Now, I don't know if this will all hit you today. As we move through this, you're going to begin to understand why this is going to help address those very local tensions of, wait, who's in charge here? Are the Gentiles better? Are the Jews better? The Jews feel like they've been cut off and eliminated and they've rejected, so maybe now we're the Gentiles where God really wanted to go. And so much of this goes back to that situation and says, look, there's a future for them too, so don't get the big head Gentiles. Okay? And so then finally include 1 to 16, and I can't even remember what I was thinking there, so I'm just going to put it up there. Oh, and here's what it looks like in the meantime as he's putting the world back together, one community at a time. Because when we get to 14 and 15, it's going to be a big deal about whether or not these Jews and Gentiles can actually get along and putting the world back together. So, in that sense, it is about the righteousness of God that God is going to put the world back together, and he's even doing it right now underneath your noses, and you may not even notice it. Okay? So, now there's a couple other fun things I want to show you to begin with before we actually dive into the text, and that is this, a great chart. What I hope is a great chart. We've kind of seen it before, haven't we? You've seen parts of this chart. You saw the first 2 parts in the story of Galatians. But what chapters talk about the middle red center? Individuals restored to God. I'm going to say probably, well, I'll just describe individuals restored to God. Communities restored to each other. Earth restored to mankind here. This is really kind of the expanding what you see in Romans. And then using Israel. So, in chapters 1 to 7, we're going to talk a lot about that. Communities restored to each other, a lot of that in 12 to 16. Earth restored to mankind, a lot of that in chapter 8. And using Israel to do it, 9 to 11. Just another way to kind of synthesize the book or to picture what's going on. So you get this very holistic picture of what the gospel is, okay? Tim Keller has a quick definition of the gospel that I have kind of memorized just because it seems so good. And when I first heard it, it didn't seem to make sense. And I realized that is the full gospel. And he describes it as this: God's work, the work of God in Christ to restore and redeem his material creation. That's pretty succinct and comprehensive. It's God's work. He's using Christ to do it. He is redeeming his people and restoring his material creation. Material means everything that's made out of stuff, right? Including you and the earth. And that whole thing is the big picture. Now, the only thing he leaves out is he didn't leave it out too much, but he left a little bit. He left a little bit of 9 to 11 out. He left a little bit of Israel out. But he did say Jesus, and Jesus is Jewish, so that kind of counts, okay? Right? As a working definition, it's a pretty good one. Now, I want to talk about this obedience of faith thing just a little bit, because you saw that back here in verse 5. Through him we've received grace in our apostleship to bring up about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles on behalf of his name. And you know what 1 through 6 are all about. Now, watch this magic right before your very eyes. Are you ready for this? This is so much fun. Are you ready? It's going to happen here in just a second. Come on. Oh, goodness sakes. I'm so stupid. I thought I did this to begin with, but I didn't. Last 3 verses of the book. What is that? What does that mean? You realize what it is? It's what? It's the gospel. It's exactly what you just saw. It's 1 to 6, put in the blender and come out just almost the same words, but the very same thing, right? All the important concepts that you just saw in 1 to 6 are right there at the very end. To him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the proclamation of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery that's been kept secret for long ages. I mean, all this just goes right back to the first 5 verses. But now is disclosed and through prophetic scriptures has been made known to all the nations, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. So, do you think that Paul has a certain big idea in mind? Well, the book is very coherent, and that's why the final assignment for this class is for you to be able to trace that coherence all the way through, because it's there. And if you just think it's a big, abstract, systematic theology, you've missed it, because there's a coherent thread, works all the way through, and you guys are going to be able to speak it by the time we get to the end. Hopefully, it'll change your life forever. You'll remember it. So, the only other thing I want to talk about is that phrase, obedience of faith. And here's where I want to do it. There is another place in the Old Testament that uses a phrase very similar to this. And this is so obscure, I doubt that you would get this if I gave you hours to think about it. But I'm just going to give it a shot anyway. There's a great verse in the book of Genesis somewhere. So that narrows it down to 50 chapters. It's not Genesis 3, it's not Genesis 12. But it's another really, 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 really important verse in the book of Genesis, which I know you have heard before and you've seen of, that kind of includes this idea of the obedience of faith. Any ideas where we're going with this? Steve? Abraham's faith being counted as righteousness, Genesis 15:6. That's a really, really good verse. But I don't think it talks about obedience there. It's a good guess, really good guess. It's a little more obscure than that even. Daniel? Yeah, Genesis 22 even comes closer. It builds on what Stephen was saying, and it talks about his obedience being made, his faith being made full. But where it is this one. Think about this. Genesis 49:10. Remember this verse? Now just read that and let it sink in for a second. From the tribe of Judah will come one in whose hand this staff, this ruler's staff, this scepter will belong, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. Now, where was Paul in chapter 1, verses 5 and 6? I want to get all the nations to come to the obedience of the faith at the hand and at the command of Jesus Christ, who was prophesied in the Old Testament as the one who would come to do this. Do you understand how this is just so richly a part of probably what Paul was thinking when he was writing this stuff? There it is right there. When he says the obedience of faith for the nations, where do you think he got that from? You got it from right here, right? From all along, the descendant of David was actually going to not only rule over Israel and save Israel, but also bring about the obedience of faith among all the nations. And so, what you've got here is this, I think, a heartfelt and passionate following of God's ways that comes from a confident trust in the goodness and greatness of the promise maker. He and his ways are so good, right? So that when the nations come to realize who he is, they say, we simply want to obey because we believe in who he is. So, this gospel clearly has definite Old Testament roots, and it's going to be an awful lot of fun to look at. And I think that's all I want to talk to you about here, I suppose. Yeah, we'll talk about that next time. I think that's enough for now. So, for Tuesday, main thing you get to do is, well, Jared, you haven't got anything to do. You're good. Make sure you print out the notes for Romans. And as you're working through the homework, some of it is already up here. We've already covered it, like the first part is the history of the church. You can kind of fill in your notes from the PowerPoint there. And mark up your notes, the notes on Romans 1 to 16, as you're filling out the homework. Bring that with you, and I think we'll be all set. Is there anything I missed? How many people have massive projects over this weekend? Are those because of projects you have to do or tests you had next week? Both? Okay. All right, well, let me pray for you before we go, okay? Let me pray. Lord, I'm so grateful for this class. Thank you for these people who want to know you and know your word, and I pray that you would just really, really bless as we get into this book of Romans and teach us your truth from the inside out and make it affect us on the inside. Help us to be able to certainly not master it, but help us to understand it and to make it our own, and pray that your Spirit would impress it upon our hearts and write it on our hearts and help us to be the kind of people that Paul was dreaming about here and that Moses was dreaming about Gentiles who obey from the heart because of our faith in you. And I pray for everybody this weekend as it comes up. I pray that you would give them wisdom, help them to use their time wisely, give them strength, give them the persistence to work through and to work hard and to do their work and their homework as unto you, not as unto men or professors, but as an act of sacrifice to you. Help them to do that and prepare well, and just bless. Help our lives to be those things, those kinds of things which you can easily and happily bless. So I ask your blessing on this weekend and the work we do in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. See you on Tuesday, everybody.